The Bible is full of unsettling events that don't always leave the reader feeling particularly comfortable. Amongst all the parables and narratives, some of which can be taken literally or allegorically depending on your faith or fancy, there are a number of darker, more insidious events that turn an otherwise holy book into something quite chilling. Women are frequently seen to be brutally raped. Cities are vanquished in mass devastations. Men are mutilated, plagued with disease, forced to bear the brunt of a vengeful deity who only seems to become more and more angry with them. And then there are the children, who, as far as the biblical accounts are concerned, don't stand much of a chance either. To the modern audience, the act of sacrificing a child in any capacity, let alone in what can only be described as some dark occultist ritual, is one of the most disturbing things that one can conceive. By all means, it's something you might expect to find in some esoteric mystic grimoire, or loosely attached to what the layman would describe as a satanic ritual. But you probably wouldn't expect to find it so openly addressed as much as it is in the traditional Bible. Indeed, as told to us by author Heath D. Durrell in his work Child Sacrifice in Ancient Israel, whilst many of the Bible's horror stories might conjure up uncomfortable images of genocide and war, the sacrificing of innocent children, specifically one's own children, evokes a level of horror that easily overshadows any other misdeed that springs from its pages. The idea that child sacrifice was conducted by the ancient Israelites might be a bitter pill for some believers to swallow, especially those who trace their faith back to these very people. Even today, scholars are undecided as to whether such rituals were practiced by these ancient people. On the one hand, the Hebrew Bible itself warns several times against the practice of child sacrifice, and even Yahweh himself is seen to condemn the act, perhaps a deliberate intention to distance himself and his people away from the terrible business. Yet to other scholars, it becomes increasingly apparent that child sacrifice was very much on the cards for the ancient Israelites, and perhaps even more scathingly, is that whilst Yahweh did explicitly condemn child sacrifice, most notably in Jeremiah 7:31, before that, it was fair game. While some argue that child sacrifice was a foreign invention, practiced first by the Canaanites or the Ammonites and only shared with the Israelites, an even more blistering approach is that Yahweh himself was in fact once the recipient of such offerings. Such an idea stems from the law of the firstborn, a statement by Yahweh to various fathers in the Bible that their firstborn child effectively belonged to him. For example, in Exodus 13:2, God tells Moses, "Sanctify unto me all the firstborn. Whatsoever openeth the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and of beast, it is mine." Meanwhile, in Numbers 3:11-13, we are told, "Because all the firstborn are mine, for on that day that I smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I hallowed unto me all the firstborn in Israel, both man and beast. Mine they shall be. I am the Lord." Now, depending on your interpretation, this might simply be God's way of emphasizing the importance of the firstborn's faith. The firstborn sets the example for any subsequent sons, and so it is imperative that he is God-fearing and righteous, so that he may instill these same virtues into his brothers and sisters. Yet to others who interpret this differently, God is literally requesting, no, demanding the actual lives of the firstborn as part of a much darker covenant between himself and the father in question. The lives of the infant son do not belong to the father, but rather belong to God, and as per this interpretation, he expects them to be given back to him. These two contradictory interpretations frame Yahweh in two very different lights. One where he is simply encouraging the father to raise the child to acknowledge him, and yet another who is insidiously advising him to actually give him the child, in a manner of sacrifice. Durrell writes of this, "Some deny that Yahweh ever desired that children be offered to him at all, whilst others claim that Yahweh did in fact have a claim to some children, especially firstborn children." Various biblical writers nonetheless found creative and often conflicting ways of avoiding the conclusion that children actually ought to be killed and offered to Yahweh. We see the most obvious way in which biblical writers dismissed such an idea was by showcasing firstborn sons in virtually all biblical families. For example, Abel is not sacrificed by Adam, but rather killed by his brother Cain. Esau is not killed by Isaac, but is actually shown to be preferred by his father over his younger brother Jacob. Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob, whilst slighted and deemed unfit to inherit his birthright, is never even thought of being sacrificed. Therefore, it might be deduced that if there was ever an Israelite tradition that firstborn children were meant to be sacrificed to Yahweh, then it's almost counterintuitive that no biblical patriarch ever actually does. Indeed, you might say that the verb given, in this context of giving to Yahweh, might actually pertain to something far less serious, and may even be more symbolic than anything else. One of the main ways in which some scholars suggest that Yahweh demanded child sacrifice is through Exodus 22:29-30, where we are told, "Thou shalt not delay to offer the first of thy ripe fruits, and of thy liquors. The firstborn of thy sons shalt thou give unto me. Likewise shalt thou do with thine oxen, and with thy sheep. 7 days it shall be with his dam. On the 8th day thou shalt give it to me." The preciseness of the wording does seem to imply that a child, the firstborn, be sacrificed when read standalone. It is the adverb likewise that gives us pause here, where scholars argue that there is only one way the ancient Israelite would offer up oxen and sheep to God, and so if they are offering up to God their firstborn sons in the same way, then surely this is indicative of both being sacrificed. You might also notice that God gives the parents 7 days to spend with their firstborn, and then, on the 8th day, the child shall be given to him. According to Durrell, scholars argue that this further complicates the hypothesis because this decree by God allows the child to remain 7 days with its mother for no seemingly apparent reason. What is the reason behind this 7-day grace period? And if this verse is indicative of an ancient sacrificial ritual, then why can't the sacrifice transpire a day earlier, or as soon as the baby is delivered? Can one assume that this is meant to be a grim test of separation on behalf of the parents? A form of test that would require a disturbing amount of resolve from the mother and father, who after enjoying their newborn for a set of 7 days, would then be required to give him up. Durrell supplies one conclusion, telling us, the literal wording of this ideal unambiguously demands child sacrifice, and it does not allow for a range of options. The fact that Exodus elaborates that giving involves separation from the child's mother narrows the range of interpretive possibilities considerably. It is difficult to imagine what might be intended other than sacrifice if the act involves separating an 8-day-old from its mother. Yet others have contradicted this notion that the verse in Exodus 22 has anything to do with the sacrificing of children at all, but still concede that there must have been something required of the parents for this 7-day window to have been specifically mentioned. Old Testament scholar William Robert Smith argued in the 19th century that to conclude that Exodus, that at one time the Israelites actually sacrificed all of their firstborn sons, is absurd. But on the other hand, there must have been some point of attachment in ancient custom for the belief that the deity asked for such a sacrifice. This is further supported by scholar Roland Vaux in his studies of the Old Testament sacrifice, who also happened to use the term absurd to describe the notion that the ancient Israelites would even entertain such an idea. He wrote, "It would be absurd to suppose that there could have been in Israel, or among any other people, at any moment in their history, a constant general law compelling the suppression of the firstborn, who are the hope of the race." You only need to look at the biblical narratives of Abraham and Sarah, or Jacob and Rachel, to see how imperative the firstborn son was. Sarah was so desperate to conceive a son for Abraham that she willingly allowed him to sleep with her servant Hagar so that they could preserve the family line. Rachel's firstborn in Joseph was so imperative that he superseded his older half-brothers, and became the sole inheritor of his father's household. In short, whilst the second-born is usually the son to inherit the household, and the second-born is considered to be the more favoured by God, the biblical characters are seen to go above and beyond in order to just have one child. Many of the women are considered barren for large portions of their life, and though they are desperate for children, are believed to suffer miserably until God decides that they can be fertile. All that to say, it seems very unlikely that any of the ancient Israelites would then sacrifice something they had spent so long pining for. What's more, as Roland Vaux puts it, the ancient Israelites would have put a lot of stock in the next generation. They really were the hope of the race, especially in a time when living conditions were harsher, cot deaths were more likely, and general survivability was less assured as it is today. Therefore, sacrificing their children would be certainly counterproductive, especially for a community that was so geared towards populating their respective communities. Another idea, albeit a little messed up, is that in sacrificing one's firstborn and giving Yahweh his due, as per Exodus 22, the parent was then eligible for certain long-term benefits. If the first of the crops or the livestock were given to Yahweh, it could be assumed in ancient times that the remainder of the crops or livestock would then be blessed, presumably multiplied in a later yield, almost as if by compensation. The logic behind this stems from a verse in Proverbs 3:9-10, where we are told, "Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine." As we can see, giving God the first of one's yield leads to receiving an abundance of said yield later on. In the context of the firstborn children then, if an ancient Israelite was to sacrifice their firstborn to Yahweh, he'd guarantee many more children thereafter, even if he'd struggled to conceive the first time. Alternatively, we also see this theme in Jeremiah 2:3, where we are told, "Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruits of his harvest. All who devoured her were held guilty, and disaster overtook them." So whilst Proverbs ensures prosperity and abundance for he who sacrifices his first yield, Jeremiah promises disaster for he who keeps the first yield for himself. Now you're likely thinking that this sacrifice only applies to cattle and the harvest, for in these cases of Proverbs and Jeremiah, offering the firstborn child does not seem to be a requirement. It isn't even actually mentioned here. Yet as per Durrell's work, Child Sacrifice in Ancient Israel, some scholars attempt to marry these accounts up with the account in Exodus 22:29, where the sacrificing of the firstborn child is explicitly mentioned. He tells us, including children among the firstlings and firstfruits means that the logic of the first fruit offerings applied to them as well. Giving Yahweh the first of one's children would result in a large number of healthy children in return. Some scholars address the feasibility of something like this having actually transpired, and cite the mortality rates of infants as a reason why some parents might have actually considered this diabolical tradition. Durrell suggests that infant death rates were as high as 50% in ancient Israel, with cot deaths being relatively misunderstood, and in some areas chalked up to God's will, or in Babylonian cultures, linked with the Lilith or the Lilith demon. With that in mind, it is possible that the ancient Israelites, seeking to increase the survivability of their offspring and further populate their communities, would do just about anything to ensure their children actually reached adulthood. As aforementioned, child sacrifice occurs quite frequently in the biblical narrative, starting as early as Genesis. In chapter 22, we see God directly tell Abraham to present his son Isaac to him atop Mount Moriah, and that he should take the knife to his son, his only son and firstborn. The narrator is quite transparent from the very beginning, informing us that this was a test, but the drama of the tale is nonetheless palpable. God states, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." The tale has quite the haunting aspect to it, especially as we are privy to the events leading up to this moment. We are told that Abraham woke up early the next morning. He loaded up his donkey and took with him 2 servants and the young Isaac. The fact that Abraham's thoughts and emotions are not made known to us only makes the story all the more suspenseful, for we are left to assume that he complied with the Lord's intentions without question and with complete devotion, despite what was being asked of him. One might question here, considering Abraham's silent acquiescence, that this then was pretty commonplace amongst the early Israelites, and that the sacrificing of children to a higher deity wasn't all that out of the norm. Others would argue, however, that this was simply a sign of Abraham's loyalty and dedication to his God, that he would go this far as to murder his own son to appease him. The magnitude of what's about to transpire does seem to weigh on Abraham, for when he spots the sacrificial space in the distance, he commands his 2 servants to stay with the donkey, perhaps indicating the taboo of what is about to occur, for he did not wish for them to witness it either. "Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Whilst we are aware of God's command and what Abraham intends to do, Isaac is none the wiser, and shown to be just as innocent as the servants as they ascend Mount Moriah. Of course, the closer they get to the sacrificial place, even Isaac becomes more aware that they don't actually have anything to sacrifice. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And we see Abraham flat out lie and tell his son, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the sacrificial point, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then we are told that he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Once Isaac was secure, Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Now the story tells us that at the last moment, an angel appears and warns Abraham, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." With this, the test is complete. And now, after witnessing Abraham's conviction, God doesn't require Abraham to actually go through with it, but is content in knowing that he totally would have. The story ends with Abraham spotting a ram in some nearby bushes, which he chooses to sacrifice instead, and both father and son are able to return home without any further incident. It is what God tells Abraham at the end of this chapter that might link back to this idea that the ancient Israelites benefited from the sacrifice of firstborn sons. "I swear by myself that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on the earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." We address the idea from Durrell's work that the ancient Israelites may have sacrificed their firstborns with the assumption that their subsequent sons and daughters would be numerous and healthy. In essence, this wasn't some morbid offering to appease an evil deity, but rather a means to ensure future generations and future health. In this same vein, the reward Abraham receives for attempting to sacrifice his son is tantamount to this rationale. Abraham benefits from his choice to sacrifice his firstborn child, even though he wasn't aware that there would be a reward for such a terrible demand. So in some ways, it's reasonable to believe that the ancient Israelites may have been curious if a similar reward may have been in store for them, if they proved their devotion to Yahweh in the same way. In another Jewish legend, however, there exists a darker interpretation of this story, as pointed out by scholar John D. Levinson, where we are told that Abraham did go through with the sacrifice and scattered Isaac's ashes atop Mount Moriah. If this is to be believed, then this would be the first instance of child sacrifice in the Bible, and considering it transpires as early as Genesis, it almost hints at its significance with an ancient culture. On the other hand, 20th century Rabbi Abraham Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, stresses that the whole point of the angel showing up is to stop Abraham from doing what he intended to do, thus putting an end to the whole episode and showcasing God's aversion to the ritual of child sacrifice. If anything then, the story of the binding of Isaac in Genesis would serve not to promote the act of child sacrifice, but rather prohibit it, especially in a time when human sacrifices were the norm in surrounding Canaanite areas. The next instance of child sacrifice in the Bible occurs in Exodus 22, which we've already discussed. Here, Yahweh directly tells Moses that the people of Israel must give him their firstborn sons, which again, some scholars have determined was in reference to sacrifice, especially seeing as it occurs alongside the instruction to sacrifice the cattle and the sheep. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Whilst we've spoken in depth about the possibilities of this verse, another idea seems to debunk this notion that God was indeed requesting the firstborns as a sacrifice. Much later in Jeremiah, we see God outrightly condemn this practice, saying, "They have built the high places of Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in the fire. Something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind." Since God did not command it, nor did such a practice ever even enter his mind, some scholars attempt to justify that child sacrifice was therefore never an Israelite tradition, and that by his phrasing alone, it shows us what a far cry this ritual really was from his own idea of what worship should have looked like. There are two mentions of child sacrifice in Leviticus, both of which condemn the ritual and forbid it. The first reads, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Moloch, for you must profane the name of your God." In some interpretations, Moloch was an Ammonite deity who received the lives of children as a form of worship. The Bible doesn't go into too much detail about Moloch as a deity. In fact, there is a common belief that Moloch was merely the name of the ritual in which children were sacrificed. But nonetheless, the biblical God's stance on this matter is clear. He warns his people not to partake in it, and that to do so would profane his name, thus once again distancing himself from the ritual altogether. In fact, further on in Leviticus 23, we see God go as far as to delineate a punishment for those who did sacrifice their children, saying, "I myself will set my face against him, and will cut him off from his people. For by sacrificing his children to Moloch, he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name." Such warnings against this practice continue throughout the Bible. In Deuteronomy, we are told, "You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshipping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods." The sentiment is echoed again later, where we are told, "Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire." The fact that God is so clear on his forbidding of child sacrifice makes it obvious that he did not agree with it and did not want it transpiring. Yet it might be argued that the fact that he was so vocal against it and so keen to condemn it is because he was aware that some Israelites had become ensnared by these foreign gods and were adopting these practices into their everyday lives. Could it then be that in some manner, the biblical God stressed on this matter as much as he did, not to make his stance clear, but also to compensate for the Israelites who were being led astray and who were adopting these rituals into their own customs? Author James L. Kugel argues this same sentiment, suggesting that the biblical God's eagerness to condemn this practice was indicative of it transpiring in Israel as well, and that it required these warnings from God to steer them away from actively pursuing it. Child sacrifice isn't specifically mentioned in Numbers, but there are some who believe a certain cohort amongst the captured Midianites were indeed made as an offering to the biblical God. In the aftermath of the war against the Midianites, God declares to Moses that a section of the spoils should be given unto him. This included sheep, cattle, donkeys, and a total of 32 virgin women, some of which were believed to include girls. We are told, "You and Eleazar, the priest and the family heads of the community, are to count all the people and animals that were captured. Divide the spoils equally between the soldiers who took part in the battle and the rest of the community. From the soldiers who fought in the battle, set apart as tribute for the Lord 1 out of every 500, whether people, cattle, donkeys, or sheep." We can easily imagine what happened to the cattle, donkeys, and sheep, and how these might have been sacrificed to God in the same way we see countless of animals sacrificed to him. But what of the 32 virgin women and girls? There is no indication that God came down to receive them, nor any specific instruction of what was meant to be done with them. Having grouped them together with the cattle, donkeys, and sheep, it can easily be assumed that they too were sacrificed in exactly the same way. Surely God would have specified otherwise if this was not to be the case. 19th century German author Karl Falk-Leben writes of this account, "The Jews, according to Numbers chapter 31, took 61,000 asses, 72,000 oxen, 675,000 sheep, and 32,000 virgins, whose fathers, mothers, brothers were butchered. These were 16,000 girls for the soldiers, 16,000 for the priests, and on the soldiers' share there was levied a tribute of 32 virgins for the Lord. What became of them? The Jews had no nuns. What was the Lord's share in all the wars of the Hebrews if it was not blood?" Others conclude that the virgins in question, as well as the animals, were simply just kept alive, and whilst they were recognized as God's portion, they were shared amongst the Levites as spoils nonetheless, perhaps even enslaved or put to work. Now, it wouldn't be a child sacrifice video without talking about a deity or practice that's since become synonymous with the subject: Moloch. In Leviticus 18:21, the prohibition against offering children to Moloch appears within a section dedicated to forbidden sexual practices. The command, "You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Moloch," that appears here is somewhat out of the blue. Moloch is introduced without context, suggesting that the ancient audience already knew who he was and what his worship entailed. Associated with the Ammonites, a people frequently portrayed as hostile and idolatrous, Moloch carried a reputation so infamous that to further elaborate upon him was simply not necessary. The verse then functions as a stark warning. Israelites were not to adopt the practices of surrounding peoples, particularly the rituals associated with child sacrifice, which were understood to be among the gravest abominations. Some scholars have questioned why Moloch appears amid prohibitions focused largely on sexual transgressions. One minority interpretation suggests the reference concerns dedicating children to temple prostitution rather than literal sacrifice. However, the prevailing view is that these passages refer to actual human sacrifice, likely infanticide. This raises the unsettling possibility that such practices were not limited to foreign peoples, but had begun to appear among the Israelites themselves, perhaps even as a means of concealing children born from illicit unions. Read this way, Leviticus does not merely condemn foreign influence, but closes what might have been perceived as a moral loophole, a way in which a man might have disposed of the evidence and thus erased his own sin. This is made explicit in Leviticus 22-4, which outlines severe punishments for anyone, Israelite or foreigner, who engaged in Moloch worship. The offender was to be executed by the community, underscoring that child sacrifice was both a religious taboo and a social one. God warns that if the community failed to act, divine punishment would extend beyond the individual to their family as well. Responsibility then was a collective, and inaction itself became culpable. This passage shows us the depth of hostility toward Moloch worship, and the lengths to which the biblical authors believed God was willing to go to eradicate it. We are told, "Any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Moloch is to be put to death. the members of the community are to stone him. I myself will set my face against him, and will cut him off from his people. For by sacrificing his children to Moloch, he has defiled my sanctuary, and profaned my holy name. If the members of the community close their eyes when that man sacrifices one of his children to Moloch, and if they fail to put him to death, I myself will set my face against him. By the time of 1 Kings 11, Moloch appears in the narrative of Solomon's decline. Led astray by his foreign wives, Solomon is said to have built high places for multiple deities, including Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. While other gods are mentioned with relative neutrality, Moloch is singled out with explicit moral revulsion. Although Solomon is not shown directly sacrificing children, his endorsement of Moloch worship appears to violate the very laws set out in Leviticus. In this section of the Bible, we are told Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. The reckoning comes in 2 Kings 23, where King Josiah dismantles the remnants of this idolatry. He desecrates Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so that no further child sacrifices can take place. This location later becomes associated with Gehenna, a place of fire and judgment, reinforcing the symbolic link between Moloch worship and ultimate corruption. The reforms present Josiah as the antithesis of Solomon, undoing the legacy of foreign gods and bringing Moloch's public worship to an end. Moloch's final biblical appearance comes retrospectively in Jeremiah 32:34, where God reflects on Judah's sins during the Babylonian siege. Despite Josiah's reforms, God accuses the people of having built high places to sacrifice their children to Moloch, an act he claims never entered his mind. The language is telling. Moloch worship is portrayed not merely as disobedience, but as something fundamentally alien to God's nature. Yet another entity commonly associated with child sacrifice is Baal, and this likely stems from the same passage in Jeremiah, where once again, the biblical God attempts to distance himself from child sacrifice and remind the Israelites that this was not something he ever intended to be a part of. We are told, "They have built high places to Baal to burn their children in the fire as offerings to Baal, something I did not command or mention, nor did it enter my mind." As if to exemplify his disgust of this ritual before this Baal, the biblical God declares that the place where these rituals are taking place will be remembered soon as the Valley of Slaughter. Again, there exist several schools of thought concerning this Baal, with some suggesting that in the biblical context it was merely a term for Lord, whilst others stand by the idea that this was a prominent Canaanite deity. According to author Tom Stark in his work The Human Faces of God, he argues that the two are one in the same, and that Baal was merely a generic Semitic term for Lord and could be frequently applied to mean Yahweh. He adds that Baal was only ever equated with the Canaanite deity as late as the 8th century, and that before this, there was a long history associating Baal with the likes of Yahweh. Others would contradict this, however, pointing perhaps instantly at Baal Haman of Carthage, a paternal deity associated with civic order, fertility, and familial continuity. Interestingly, child sacrifice is prominently associated with this entity too, with writer Gilbert Charles Pickard in his Death of Carthage remarking of the ritual, "The ceremony took place at night by moonlight. In the precinct stood a bronze statue of Baal Haman, and at his feet a pit was dug, in which a fire or topeth was lit. Around the statue stood the assistants and the parents of the victims, the musicians and the dancers. A priest would bring the child dedicated to the god, already killed according to secret rites, and lay him in the statue's arms, from which he would roll into the flames. Then flutes, tambourines and lyres would drown the cries of the parents and lead the dancers into a wild dance." We see an isolated incident of child sacrifice committed by the character Jephthah, who made a vow to God that if he was able to defeat the Ammonites in the name of Israel, he would sacrifice whatever came out of the door of his house upon his return. We are told, "And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." During the war, Jephthah, who is commanding the Israelite army, is victorious and crushes the Ammonites in a landslide victory. When he returns home, however, who should come out of his house to greet him? None other than his only daughter, who was also only a child. Now, to his credit, Jephthah obviously does not want to sacrifice her. He actually tears at his clothes and cries in anguish, but knows full well that the repercussions of denying God what he promised would be even dire. You might even cut the biblical God some slack here, because it was not he who presented this stipulation, but rather Jephthah himself, who should have known better than to suggest such a strange condition. We can't know if the biblical God would have come calling for his due here, because again, this was never his intention, but rather Jephthah's. But because he's obviously God-fearing, Jephthah has to honour it anyway. We are told that he allowed his daughter 2 months to live the remainder of her life, but that after the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. One suggestion here is that this is not an example of human sacrifice to appease Yahweh, because as aforementioned, Yahweh never asked for it in the first place, and secondarily, this was actually a punishment for Jephthah for having vowed to sacrifice a person in the first place. By this point, the biblical God had made it clear that human sacrifice was off the table, and yet because Jephthah bargained with him to do this very thing, it was, in the eyes of God, a fitting, if not ironic punishment. Considering the different biblical stories revolving around child sacrifice and the differing interpretations that are available to us, we can quite easily determine that there is no unanimity on the subject in question. Did the ancient Israelites practice child sacrifice at one point or another, or was this simply a foreign Canaanite idea that some Israelites were swayed by? Deuteronomy leads us to believe that this was exclusively a foreign practice, and that God heavily dissuaded the Israelites from ever being involved in it. Leviticus would have us believe that this was a practice by the Ammonites in tribute to a deity or ritual known as Moloch. Jeremiah paints the entity Baal as the recipient of such a dastardly offering, and splits no hairs about this being despicable and evil. If we look at the Bible alone, it's easy to see that God, for the most part, is keen to distance himself from this horrifying practice. But this would require us to overlook the fact that he asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, and allows Jephthah to sacrifice his daughter, even though the act of such things are seen to repulse him. Jarrell concludes in his work that in light of these accounts, Yahwistic child sacrifice then might actually have been a thing, but that when child sacrifice fell out of practice and faded into the past, it became much easier to spin this as some alien foreign practice that wasn't reflective of traditional Judaism. He writes, "Once the reality of child sacrifice had faded into the past, those denying that Yahweh ever desired such a thing were no longer constrained by the reality surrounding such rites, and could take the simplest route, condemning all forms of child sacrifice by tying them all to the worship of foreign gods or idols." As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.